Good. Thanks. Happy to be here, everyone. Although, as you'll see from the topic, I seem to be killing mics here. So I'm happy to be here. Although, as you'll see from the topic, it's not the world's happiest topic, but there's a lot of issues in the world lately that have seemed a little chaotic, and this is definitely one of them. I wanted to briefly mention, I see my friend Dave Carroll out there, a Penn State Berks related announcement. I know several of you folks have been able to join us in the past for taking courses at Penn State Berks through our Go 60 program, which is a special program that lets older folks take a course free of charge if you sign up close to the beginning of the semester after the regular students have already registered. And that, I know we've had several excellent folks from World Affairs Council in some of my classes, and the campus was considering stopping that program due to the cost, and thanks to the lobbying efforts of a few of our members, including some folks here, they reconsidered, and that program is continuing. So I just wanted to let you know that's an opportunity that we have. So I know especially some of our courses that deal with things like history and politics, it can be very beneficial to have a few gray hairs in the audience. Some folks who can say things like, so we're studying the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, when I was in the Navy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that really makes the 18-year-olds kind of sit up and take notice, so it can be a real addition to it. So think about that for the future, some of you possibly taking a course with us over at Penn State through that Go 60 program. Okay, so today's topic, Brexit, or the Brexit mess. So first of all, where are we? I wanted to start with that, and many of you, I think, are the kind of folks who follow the news pretty closely, so you are aware of many of these things, but just to kind of review, how did we get here? Of course, the Brexit vote took place in June 2016. The government of the UK had assumed that the people would vote to remain. They just wanted to hold a vote to kind of quiet down the people who were saying that the country should leave. And then to everyone's surprise, I think including the people who voted to leave, leave actually won narrowly, getting 51.9% of the vote, the leave option. A few months after that, the UK government officially submitted their intent to leave the European Union, which triggered a 2-year period in which negotiations could be held to finalize the Brexit. That was in March 2017, meaning that the deadline would be in March of 2019. Theresa May, the new Prime Minister, struggled to come up with a compromise deal, and what she finally reached, the deal she finally reached with the EU was very unattractive, and has now been voted down 3 times by the British Parliament. The Parliament, in desperation, has turned to considering other options. Should they, for example, stay in the common market but leave other parts of the EU? Should they perhaps have a second referendum? And all of the other options have been voted down as well, although in fact twice. Some of them very narrowly, however. So the initial deadline of March 29th for the country to leave the European Union came and went. It was extended to April 12th. It has been extended again to the end of October of this year, and still no prospects for resolving this. Is the country going to leave? Under what conditions? Are they maybe going to reconsider after all? It's still all very much up in the air, which is why this talk is scribbled down on a piece of paper and kind of in crayon, from, with things crossed out, because it's. I made sure to check the headlines this morning to make sure that they hadn't left overnight or something. But why is this such a mess? I think the popular story of it that you hear a lot in the press and so on is just. The British political class has completely failed. The Parliament has completely failed. Prime Minister May is a disaster. The opposition is a disaster. All these politicians are idiots. Which may be true, but I think a lot of it is too that they're facing a really hard task. They've basically been asked to shove a square peg into a round hole, and that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to deliver a painless and prosperous Brexit for the UK, and that doesn't seem very possible, I would argue. So we'll talk about that and what are some of the reasons for that, and I think a lot of it is based on what the people voted for at the time of the Brexit vote. And a lot of the things seem, looking back on it, to be very kind of contradictory within themselves. For example, a lot of the supporters of Brexit were actually somewhat left-leaning, feeling that they were pulling Britain out of globalization, that they were going to have more protectionism, that they were maybe going to safeguard and bring back some of the old manufacturing jobs. So that was one impulse behind Brexit, but at the same time, a lot of the more right-wing supporters of Brexit were supporting it precisely because they wanted to have real turbo-capitalism, complete openness to globalization and free trade, and they felt the EU was holding them back with all of its socialistic regulations. So those are really completely different impulses, and so how do you build a Brexit that will satisfy both of those? Also, the people had really been promised that Brexit would deliver a huge monetary savings to the country because they wouldn't have to pay their dues into the European Union, which was many billions of pounds a year. But the costs of Brexit were not mentioned. There's a huge divorce bill, essentially, that they're going to have to pay for things such as the pensions for EU workers, many of whom were British, that will need to be supported for decades. Development money that the EU is paying out to Turkey or Romania or whoever in the coming years that Britain has already promised to be part of. So there's huge sunk costs, and also, of course, they're going to be losing the benefits of EU membership, the subsidies coming into their farmers and development aid that they get for poorer or more unemployed areas of Britain. So, there were a lot of high expectations that aren't necessarily going to be met, and I think a lot of the problem is the nature of the EU, which, again, some of you are aware of. This is not just a treaty between countries. It really has been, and I think many of the British missed this, that especially people who perhaps didn't do a lot of traveling, who weren't involved in a lot of interactions with the European Union, but I think people thought this was just a treaty they could step out of. And what they've realized is it's more like Pennsylvania declaring that we want to leave the United States. That's a very hard thing to step out of. And as they try to do that, they realize all of this web of ties that they can't just easily step out of. So a little bit on kind of the specifics of why the selling points in different areas that were made for Brexit don't seem to work, and why it's been so hard to negotiate this exit. For example, several different areas. The people were promised that if we have Brexit, we'll have a big economic boost. That's one area I'll talk about. They were promised we'll be able to stop migration, and that will be great for the country. And they were promised, I think a lot of the underlying promise of Brexit was, we'll get back to the good old days when Britain was great. And really all three of those have had big problems of getting translated into reality. In fact, often being the opposite of what was expected. So, economic boost. Do you get an economic boost out of this? Well, as they found out, and similar to my example of a state leaving the United States, you are so integrated with your neighbors. I mean, you can imagine, for example, how would we exist as the state of Pennsylvania? What would we even eat? Shoe-fly pie, I guess. But you lose the produce from California. You lose and the fact that all the supply chains for all your businesses are completely linked to your neighbors I mean, you can't make a car in Pennsylvania without many, many parts that are coming in from other states, and often things would be partly assembled in Pennsylvania and then shipped over to Canada and then back to Detroit and then back to Pennsylvania before the thing is even assembled. And of course, that's what the British have found out, particularly in areas such as cars. The auto industry in Europe is completely integrated in that way, and I remember reading that, for example, parts for the Mini Cooper, there were some assemblies, some parts of that car that went back and forth across the channel 4 times before they were finally assembled in Britain. And you can imagine if there's a barrier there, how on earth is that going to work? And so what's been happening, of course, is that a lot of the car industry has been pulling out of Britain. They've been announcing, well, this just doesn't look like a place we can manufacture anymore. We'll move over to the continent. And that's been a real problem. And another good example is Airbus. Many of you have flown in Airbus planes. You know they're the main competitor to Boeing, and actually doing a little better than Boeing at the moment. But Airbus is a completely integrated consortium between different European countries, and so in many of the Airbus planes, the wings are made in Britain. Just the wings. You know, that doesn't do you a whole lot of good. That's the British aerospace industry, is wings. And you can imagine by itself that's not going to sell very well. And of course Airbus has pointed out to them there's a lot of other factories in Europe that would love to have that contract. And Britain just is not at all in the position to make its own planes. So that you have a lot of examples like that that will just make it hard for Britain economically, and they just don't have the economies of scale for modern manufacturing. You know, that being a country of about 50 million, it's hard to imagine a lot of say new companies wanting to set up if they can only serve the British market. It just doesn't make sense economically. So as I said, a lot of industry has been pulling out to move to the European continent, and the danger of that is that once the industries move, even if Britain changes its mind and stays in, they may be gone. I mean, because of course if you're a company, you're not going to want to pay twice to move your factory. Once you've moved it, you're going to want to stay where you are. So this could cause some real long-term damage to the British economy. Another area of damage that they've seen is in the finance sector. And you know, money is very easy to shift, even easier than shifting factories. You can move your financial holdings over to Frankfurt, Germany, or Amsterdam, Netherlands. And this has long been a big strength of the British, their finance sector. You might have heard of, they call it the city. The city of London is a section of London where a lot of the big banks are headquartered, and it's basically the Wall Street of Europe. And a lot of those big banks have either been shifting all of their operations over to the continent, or at least many of their operations. And again, once those jobs go over, are they necessarily going to come back? Because these financial companies have got to have seamless access to the other 450 million customers in Europe. That's something that they rely on, and all these little financial regulations that have been harmonized with Europe, if that falls apart, then it just doesn't make sense to keep your business in the UK. The claim was that a lot of this would be made up for by a big boost in trade with the rest of the world. That the British would be able to have free trade agreements, especially with a lot of their former colonies. I think there was a lot of this kind of nostalgia for the empire, and we'll create wonderful new trade ties with India, for example, that will go beyond what the EU is able to do. They're having a lot of trouble with that. They're finding, for example, that how attractive of a partner are we? We're not the great empire anymore. We're a mid-sized European country with only 50 million people, and India's looking down on us now. That's a bit of a shock. And saying, you were not an attractive partner anymore. And another practical problem that they didn't even think of, and there's a lot of problems like this, which is the EU did so much for them that they weren't realizing. What they realized is the British government did not even have a department to negotiate international trade. Because all of that had been done for decades by the EU, by the common market. And when Brexit passed, they started advertising frantically for 400 or 500 international trade specialists that they would like to hire to start building the expertise to negotiate their own trade treaties, which they had no idea how to do. So that has not gone very fast. Okay, so economic problems. The migration area I mentioned was of course a big inducement for why you might want to leave the EU. You know, they had the large waves of migration coming into Europe in the past few years. That was alienating to many people in Britain, but even immigration from within the EU was seen as a problem. For example, a lot of people from Poland and other East European countries had moved to Britain to work. And you were starting to see things like Polish grocery stores in Oxford, and this was alienating to some people who felt, you know, we need to have better control of migration. But one of the things they forgot was there's a couple of million British living in Europe. Because due to this, you know, steadily, quietly increasing links with the continent, it's now routine for British people to retire in Spain, to take, you know, to travel very casually all over Europe. For example, you might know that the British have a bit of a drinking reputation. And it's become common to do bachelor parties and things in places like Tallinn, Estonia, because you can get cheap air flights over there, and the beer and the hotels are really cheap over there in Eastern Europe, so you get thousands of drunken Brits going through the streets of Tallinn, Estonia, or Riga, or, you know, and so the times have changed, you know. This is not the old Britain that used to be so isolated. One of the favorite quotes that I like is from that shows kind of the British mentality, which I think is part of Brexit, is this island mentality. This was back at the time of Queen Victoria, and the Times of London once had a large headline when there was a big bank of fog for many days across the British Channel, and the headline said, "Fog in Channel, continent isolated." You know, that's kind of the mentality there. So, but they're not isolated anymore. And what do you do with the millions of British citizens who now are retired in Spain or married to a man in Germany or whatever? If you cut off the migration coming in your direction, of course, what's their legal status? So what has happened is thousands of British citizens are now giving up their British citizenship and becoming citizens of other countries, which for Britain, what a slap in the face. You know, of course, this is the country that people have always gone to. And for example, a lot of Brits are becoming German citizens. And think about that. How desperate you must be as a British to become a German citizen, given their history. But and they've also found that a lot of these migrants that they were raising questions about, especially the ones from within the EU, are actually very valuable people. For example, a huge percentage of the doctors in the British National Health System and the nurses in the British National Health System are from places like Poland. And if you cut off that migration, are they allowed to stay? And under what conditions? And what rights do they have? Etc. And none of that's been resolved. And so they're realizing there's some real migration costs here. Another one, in my area of work in academia, the universities in Britain have come to rely on students from all over the European Union. You can imagine if you're German or Swedish or Italian, how nice it would be to study at Oxford. So they've been able to come and go freely with financial support from the European Union, and researchers and professors have been able to come and go freely. And the degrees of all the different European universities are recognized by all the other countries under the EU. And if that's cut off, these universities are really wondering, what happens now? I'm in the middle of a 10-year research project with professors from Italy and Germany and Sweden that's all funded by the European Union, and is that all going to be cut off? And we're going to lose our participation in Europe-wide things like the European Space Agency and things like that have been a big part of academic and technological stuff. So, and finally, the idea of, well, this will bring a stronger UK, this will bring us back to greatness. It could cause them to lose a lot of their country. Many of you have followed this, and you know that one of the big issues currently is the status of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU, but also, of course, especially those of us who are a little older, remember that Northern Ireland has had some issues. As they call it, the Troubles. And for decades, one faction within Northern Ireland has been fighting to join Ireland. Another faction has been fighting to stay in the United Kingdom. And for many years, from the 1970s through the 90s, there was basically a guerrilla war going on with bombings and assassinations and so on between the Irish Republican Army on the one side and the Unionist forces on the other side that wanted to stay in the UK. And they were finally able to resolve that in the 1990s, largely because of the common European Union membership. That was a huge help, because they were able to say to both factions, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. You can we'll keep Northern Ireland in the Union, so the Unionist forces will be happy, but we'll also be completely open to the rest of Ireland, so the Irish Republican forces can be happy. We will completely abolish the border between those two zones, so it's now one of these European borders that you just step across, like stepping from Pennsylvania to New Jersey, with no customs checks, with no police, with no soldiers, with nobody searching you. And that has played a huge role in pacifying Northern Ireland and bringing about the end of that war. And now, of course, the question is, what do you do now? Because if the United Kingdom secedes from the EU, then you really have to have a border there. Because you're going to have, for example, the UK has a new trade agreement with India. So cheap Indian products maybe are flooding into the United Kingdom. Well, then people would just take it into Ireland. But the EU can't have that. Or vice versa, you might have migrants coming from Ireland that want to get into the United Kingdom, but the UK wants to seal off its borders for migration. So you might end up with a real, Donald Trump style border between the two halves of Ireland. That's kind of the worst case scenario, that it would really become a wall. But there would certainly have to be customs and enforcement, and that would really alienate one side of the Irish conflict. So what the EU has proposed, this is the so-called Backstop Agreement, which has really angered a lot of the Brexit forces, is that at least temporarily, Northern Ireland will sort of remain in the EU to prevent that hard border from being drawn. That they will have to try to keep their trade regulations and so on harmonized with the rest of Ireland so that you won't have the risk of that hard border. But of course, the Unionist forces within the Northern Ireland say, wait a minute, you're basically then pulling us away from the UK, which is not acceptable. So that's become a real stalemate. So there's this risk of a resumption of the Civil War in Northern Ireland, and maybe the loss of Northern Ireland, and the loss of Scotland. I mean, as again, many of you know, a couple of years ago they had a referendum in Scotland which narrowly resulted in Scotland staying in the United Kingdom, and they hoped that problem was tamped down. But then Scotland also voted strongly to remain in the European Union, as opposed to the English vote. And so a lot of the politicians in Scotland are now saying, well, if you leave the European Union, we'll leave you, so we can stay in the European Union. So there's the risk of, rather than having a great and powerful and expanded United Kingdom, instead you may be losing territory. A lot of problems, and they've realized a lot of areas that they weren't necessarily expecting that have kind of come back to bite them because of this fact that the European Union is more integrated than they had realized. One, for example, that I remember reading about a year or so ago, many of you have flown into Heathrow. Of course, that's the #1 gateway airport for all of Europe, and that's a big economic factor for the British. The question is that role going to continue? Because you've got to have all kinds of agreements to permit those planes to go on to the rest of Europe, and maybe someone else has to be the hub for Europe. And worse than that even, they realized that it was an EU agency that was certifying all of the planes in Britain. So they don't even have, kind of like they don't have the people to negotiate their own trade agreements, they don't have anyone employed by the British government who inspects planes. They have no expertise in that whatsoever. So theoretically, the day that they leave the EU and that agency pulls out, you have no legal right to have planes flying into Britain. The planes would just stop, because you can't have modern planes flying in and out of your country without anybody there to certify that the brakes are correct, that the fuel lines work, that all of these things. So on the fly, they're having to, this is another whole area, they're having to build up their expertise, and they're finding more and more areas like that. Another one that I read about that came as a shock to some folks in Britain was all of the radioactive drugs that are used for treating cancer patients are made by an EU agency. And that raised the question of, well, when we pull out of the Union, is that going to mean that suddenly our cancer patients can't be treated? And of course, we've got people that are relying on this to stay alive. So, and those are just two of dozens of little landmines that they found out about after the vote. So, all kinds of mess here and plenty of blame to go around. So, what I think I'll conclude with is the question of where do we go from here, of course, because that's a big question. What is the plausible way forward? Is there a plausible way forward? As many of you may have heard, the kind of desperation play that Theresa May has resorted to in the last week or two is to try to form a kind of a unity agreement with her opposition, the Labour Party. She's from the Conservative Party. She's trying to bring the Labour Party in on some kind of an agreement to move forward with Brexit. Because her own Conservative Party is too fractured between people who support her version of Brexit and many people that are more hardline that don't want to make any concessions to the European Union. So the voting down of the current Brexit agreement, a lot of that has taken place with Theresa May's own Conservatives voting against her. So can she pull in people from the Labour Party to vote with her to maybe get this darn thing passed after all? So the last couple of weeks she's been trying to negotiate with Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party leader, to try to come to some kind of an agreement and shove through the treaty after all. Hasn't worked so far. I think even though Corbyn is also somewhat skeptical of the European Union, he would like a more moderate agreement that keeps Britain at least in the common market part of the EU, and the Conservatives don't want to go for that. And also I think they've probably reached the point that he's seeing what a mess this is and he doesn't want to share it. So if the Labour Party doesn't come to her rescue, what can happen here? Well, a lot of people think new elections. Oh, you have another card over there if somebody saw it. So new elections are a possibility, and a lot of people think would result in Theresa May being kicked out. But does that solve the problem? Then you've still got the situation of, are we going to have the Brexit, and under what terms? There might be a new government that comes in, maybe this summer, for example, maybe led by the Labour Party. But what good does that do? Because then they would still have to go back to the European Union and say, well, can we have a new deal? And the European Union would probably say, no, you have a deal, that's it. So, and they wouldn't want to pass it either. So the new elections may not solve the matter either. What a lot of people are asking, and I even had someone come up to me before the talk today and say, well, can't they just forget the whole thing? And apparently it is allowed for the country, as long as things aren't concluded, the country can just rescind its application to leave and take that back. So Parliament could vote to do that. Of course, then many people would say, well, you're not following the vote that the people made, and the people voted to leave, so don't you somehow have to implement that? So just the government taking it back might not be a good solution either. So many folks have said, well, you've got to get the people to vote again, a full popular vote again, redo the referendum, a second vote option. And that there have been a lot of demonstrations in Britain for that. A lot of people have signed an online petition for that. And at least some of the opinion polls I've seen show that maybe because of the chaos of the Brexit negotiations, that the Remain option might win this time. But, of course, the opinion polls showed that Remain would win before the original vote. So it's, what if they hold a second vote and they again narrowly vote to leave, but without any clarity about what that means? So I think that's one reason some folks are afraid of doing the second vote, is they're afraid that they'll lose again, and then that will really seal it. Because then that will reaffirm that the people want to leave. But anyway, it's even if some kind of solution is found, for example, even if they do push through a deal to leave, or even if they do rescind the deal somehow, or vote to remain, it seems like it's done a lot of damage already. That may be damage that's just lost. Damage to the economy, but also damage to the British people and the British government. Because one of the things that I always used to say in my comparative politics classes was that Britain is the epitome of kind of a calm, well-run country. So I often, in my political science 3 comparative government classes, would start with the British and discuss them and then contrast them to the French. And say, well, here you have two countries that are, fairly similar economically. They're right next to each other across the channel, and yet the French have had so much more of a history of governmental chaos and revolution, and so where the British have always had the stiff upper lip, the we'll get through it spirit, the calm spirit, and had a very good reputation for rule of law and doing things in an orderly fashion, which I think really helped them. Why are a lot of those companies headquartered in Britain? That's why a lot of those companies are headquartered there, because Britain has this reputation of being a calm, sensible, orderly place with laws that work. And that may have been lost, and that could really hurt the British in the long run. But on that happy note, thanks everyone.